Two girls huddled at a deserted bus stop looked at a homeless man with trembling eyes and timid voices. "Can you be our dad?" When the nearest passerby heard that, they froze, and a silence fell over everyone. The night in Chicago had advanced beyond comfort, transforming the streets into cold and deserted passages. Henry, a middle-aged man with disheveled gray hair, had been wandering for hours seeking a minimal corner where he could find shelter. It was a harsh winter, and the city showed no sympathy. Multicolored neons blinked in the distance, reflecting in dirty puddles, while the deafening signs of empty bars created artificial lighting that was more disturbing than helpful. Under the yellowish light of a lamppost, Henry adjusted the damp cardboard he would use as a mattress. It was his only defense against the freezing cement that punished his joints. Even feeling every bone ache, he struggled to stay strong, at least enough to get through another dawn. Around him, the sound of hurried cars cut through the streets, the distant roar of engines and the dragging of garbage bags being pulled by scavengers like him. No calm. Even at that hour of the night, there was always some mechanical noise, some distant siren, a bar murmur, or a nervous laugh that got lost in the wind. Indifference was the rule, and Henry was no longer surprised to be invisible to most. But that night, a heavier weight seemed to fall on his shoulders. The cold was more intense, the hunger deeper, the exhaustion more real. He adjusted his torn coat, whose empty pockets reminded him of the lack of any minimal resource to ease the hardness of daily life. Henry leaned against the wall of a closed store. The promise of shelter under the awning was fragile. Still, better that than nothing. He stretched his legs over the wet cardboard, trying to find a less painful position. He was about to close his eyes when he noticed a strange movement across the sidewalk. At first, he thought it was an illusion caused by fatigue. He squinted, furrowed his brow, forcing his vision. There, at the deserted bus stop, were two small silhouettes. Children. This was unusual at that hour. Who would leave children exposed in such a lonely place? He stood up with difficulty, propping himself against the wall, feeling his knee creak. He approached a bit, cautiously. His tired gaze tried to understand the scene. Two little girls, wearing flowery dresses that didn't match the weather, huddled on the bus stop bench. There were no adults nearby, no sign of mother, father, or guardian. This made Henry's chest tighten. The image was strange and distressing. The two children, Emily and Claire, names he would only come to know later, seemed as displaced as he was, but in a crueler way. He could imagine the pain they must be feeling in their fragile bodies, without coats, without human warmth, exposed as if the night were a monster ready to swallow them. Henry hesitated. Approaching children in that situation could be risky. He was homeless, invisible, dirty, suspicious in anyone's eyes. What if someone misinterpreted the gesture? What if the police arrived and saw him as a criminal? The world was hard on those without homes. Any good deed could be viewed with suspicion. Still, how could he ignore it? Looking away would be easier, but also unforgivable. The memory of his own daughter, taken away by a distant and cruel separation, hit hard. Many years had passed, but the pain persisted. He knew what it was to lose a piece of himself. Now, faced with those girls, the feeling was unbearable. After all, someone needed to do something, and there was no one else there. He himself was nothing but a tired man without possessions, but he still had his humanity. He came closer, slow steps, hands visible, voice soft so as not to frighten them. The cold light from a closed restaurant sign outlined his tired features, the unshaven beard, the worried look. As he approached the bus stop, the girls huddled together, so terrified they seemed to want to sink into the bench itself. Henry stopped at a safe distance, raising his hands slightly in a gesture of peace. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. No immediate response came, just large, frightened eyes, lips trembling without making a sound. It was as if fear had paralyzed their voices. Henry moved a bit closer, taking off the worn coat he was wearing. He thought about the cold he felt, but quickly concluded that his suffering was nothing compared to theirs. Without saying much, he extended the coat toward the girls. The sincere act, though frightening in such a situation, made one of them give a small start. The other, weaker and trembling heavily, seemed to understand the offer. No words, just looks trying to measure whether the stranger was a danger or an unlikely savior. Henry tried a slight smile without showing teeth, something that wouldn't threaten. The empty street, illuminated only by distant reflections, made the scene seem unreal, like a picture hastily painted by a sad artist. Very carefully, he placed the coat over the tiny shoulders of the girls. He felt the rough texture of the fabric as he pulled the collar and wrapped them a bit better. In the distance, a car passed quickly, noticing nothing. Life went on. Henry stayed there, crouching, not knowing exactly what to do. He thought about calling someone, asking a passerby for help. Someone more respectable than him, someone who wouldn't raise doubts. He needed to ensure the girls would be safe, that they would receive attention. But who would stop to listen to him? Who would believe his words? Still, he had to try. The tension was escalating. A figure was walking on the sidewalk across the street, an indistinct adult silhouette. Henry stood up, called out with a weak voice, "Please, there are 2 children here." The man ignored him at first. Henry insisted, raising his tone, "Hey, excuse me, help me." Only then did the man turn his head, looking at Henry with eyes marked by suspicion. He approached a few steps, noticing the children covered by the worn coat. Before Henry could explain, the man frowned, spitting distrust. "What's this? Using children to get money, you bum." The harsh words fell like stones. Henry tried to defend himself, stammering, "No, it's not that. They're alone, But the man interrupted, shaking his head with disgust, muttering insults and pointing his finger. The girls huddled closer, frightened by the tone of voice and the anger of that person. Henry felt his throat tighten. This was everything he didn't need right now. He was trying to help and was being taken for an exploiter. There was no point in arguing. The man was already walking away, shaking his head and letting out ironic laughs. They were alone again. Henry bit his lip, feeling the humiliation and powerlessness. He needed to think of another solution. He ran his hand across his own forehead, wiping away droplets of cold sweat, while the night wind whipped his face. What to do? The police could be an option, but he doubted they would treat him any better. Still, leaving the girls there was unthinkable. He turned to them, speaking carefully. "I'm going to try something else, okay? Don't worry." The girls didn't respond, just the frightened look. The street was quieter now, almost sinister. The cold made his head hurt, his whole body scream for shelter. But it was their lives that mattered now. It was necessary to insist, find someone who would pay attention, maybe a police officer. Not that Henry believed much, but in desperation, authority could be a way. Hesitantly, he closed the coat better around the girls, making a protective gesture before stepping away. Maybe if the authorities saw the situation without intermediaries, they would understand. Henry took a deep breath, smelling the acid scent of the dirty street. He needed to be strong, needed to try. He clenched his fist, gathered courage. The image of the 2 trembling children in the wind forced his heart to beat faster. No, he wouldn't abandon them there. Even if it cost him his own peace, he needed to take the risk. There, at that corner illuminated by unhealthy lamps, between puddles of water and torn posters, Henry took the first step to face a world that had always pushed him into the shadows. His gaze slid over the girls, measuring the distance to the corner where he had seen a police officer earlier. Even knowing the risks, he decided to move forward. He would walk there and ask for help, even if he was thrown to the ground, cursed at, pushed. He couldn't cower. The sensation was that a thin layer of ice was forming on his bones, not just from the night's temperature, but from the tension that hung in the air. Still with the image of the two little girls stamped in his mind, Henry stretched his neck, trying to see if the police officer was still there. He would endure the humiliation, face the distrust, but wouldn't allow himself to ignore two abandoned children. Each second seemed heavier than the previous one. A shiver ran down his spine, like a reminder that he was alone in this uncertain journey. Everything indicated that the night would be long and decisive. Henry feels a shiver, not just from the cold, but from the certainty that his next action will forever change the course of that night. Henry remained there, the wind cutting his face and the streetlights casting uncertain shadows on the sidewalk. Next to him, the girls remained huddled under the coat he had lent them. The younger one, with teary eyes, raised her face now and then, as if trying to understand the strange man who cared about them. The older one, still clutching the worn fabric, tried to keep her sister protected, forming a thin barrier against the cold night. He was determined to find someone to help, maybe a police officer, but didn't want to leave them alone and vulnerable for even a second. It was at that moment that a thin voice, almost a trembling whisper, broke the silence. "Can you be our father?" The question came out like that, raw and unexpected from the younger girl. It was the voice of a confused child, frightened and so desperate that she sought a father figure in any face, a safe harbor. Henry felt his stomach sink. That was an absurd and moving request at the same time. He swallowed hard, not knowing what to answer. I'm not your father, dear. His voice failed, letting the words dance in the cold air. He couldn't promise something so big. Without a home, without means, without any guarantee, the most he could offer was temporary support. But the question had hit him hard, reminding him of his own lost daughter, whom he hadn't seen in so many years. He tried to keep calm and his voice gentle. "I'll try to help you, okay? But I need to find someone who can really do this, someone who knows what to do." The children just looked, each in their own way, immersed in confusion and fear. Henry took a deep breath. He needed to find a trustworthy adult, someone who could take them to a safe place. He looked around. The flow of people was sparse, but there was still a chance of finding someone passing by hurriedly, someone with minimal sensitivity. He saw a woman in a dark coat walking quickly across the street. Not wanting to frighten the children, Henry said, "Wait here just a minute." And he took a few steps forward, raising an arm, calling carefully, "Excuse me, miss, please, it's urgent." The woman gave him a sideways glance. Before Henry could explain, she quickened her pace, completely ignoring him. He couldn't give up like that. He returned to the bus stop, trying not to appear defeated. He needed to be more persistent. A little further ahead, he spotted a man in a suit, probably leaving work late. Henry tried again, raising his hand to get his attention. "Excuse me, sir. Please help me. There are 2 children here alone." The man stopped, analyzing the scene. The homeless man in a worn coat next to 2 huddled girls. He raised an eyebrow, twisting his mouth, clearly uncomfortable. "What's this about?" he asked suspiciously. Henry made an effort to keep his tone calm. "I found these children alone at the bus stop. I think they were abandoned. They're cold and I need help taking them somewhere safe." The man let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think I'm going to fall for that? What kind of scam is this now? Using children, huh?" Henry's eyes widened, shocked. No, sir, you don't understand. They really are alone." But the man wouldn't listen. He shook his head, irritated. "Don't come at me with that, you bum. These days you can't trust anyone." And he walked away without looking back, spitting words of contempt into the wind. The reaction was a punch to the stomach. Henry felt his legs shake. He thought about shouting, arguing, but it would be of no use. Reality was relentless. He went back to the girls who now stared at him confused, sensing the hostility in the environment. "Don't think it's your fault. I'll try something else." The children just lowered their heads, saying nothing. The silence that hung was heavy, a burden that weighed on Henry's shoulders. He felt caught between moral obligation and social powerlessness. How could he prove he was just trying to help? Who would believe him? He looked at the street again. This time he noticed a distant figure, perhaps a police officer standing on the corner under a dim lamp. Henry got a chill, remembering that police officers were rarely kind to people like him. But what else could he do? He had no choice. It was the only authority nearby and the last hope for immediate assistance. Before making the final decision, he tried to calm the children. "Look, I'm going to call a police officer. He'll help you. Don't worry, I won't disappear." The girls, still scared, pressed closer together, holding the coat tightly. With no more time to waste, Henry took a few steps toward the corner, careful not to lose sight of the girls. When he turned around, he saw that they were still sitting, looking at him expectantly, although frightened. On the way, his mind was buzzing with uncertainties. What would he do if the police officer treated him like a criminal? What if they accused him of something horrible? Still, it was better to try than to abandon them to the cruel night. He could feel the tension in his own skin, every movement being watched by invisible eyes from closed windows, every noise of the city sounding like an alert. His hands were sweating, his heart beating heavily. Passing by a metal trash bin, Henry noticed the diffuse reflection of himself. A middle-aged man, disheveled hair, worn countenance. The time when he had a job, family, a normal life seemed distant. Now, all he had was a cold night, 2 lost children, and the unexpected responsibility of doing the right thing. He swallowed his doubts and moved forward. In the distance, the police officer maintained a rigid posture, arms crossed, observing the street with boredom and suspicion. Before reaching him, Henry took a deep breath. He couldn't approach aggressively or desperately. He needed to be clear and honest. When he was a few meters away, he raised his hands to chest level, showing he posed no threat. His voice came out firm, though trembling. "Good evening, officer. Excuse me for bothering you, but there are 2 children alone at the bus stop over there. Please, we need help." The officer narrowed his eyes, casting a penetrating look. "What do you mean, children alone?" Henry tried to explain quickly. "They were abandoned. They're there, cold, scared. I tried to call someone, but nobody believes me. I don't know these girls. I just want them to be safe." As he spoke, Henry felt each syllable weighing on his shoulders. He was homeless, and the officer's figure made him uneasy. It was the first spark of hope, but also a tremendous risk. He still hadn't gotten the officer's reaction, who continued analyzing the situation with skepticism. Henry maintained a fixed and sincere gaze. He couldn't look away, couldn't show weakness now, or the officer might suspect something worse. The silence between them lasted a few seconds, but seemed much longer. Henry knew that if the officer didn't want to help, there would be no plan B. The pressure was enormous. Behind him, the girls waited, defenseless, needing a simple miracle. Someone willing to see them as people, not as a scam. Henry felt his jaw tighten. His heart was racing, but he tried not to show nervousness. He thought of the little girl's question. "Can you be our father?" That had hit him in a way he couldn't explain. He couldn't be their father, that wasn't the role, but he couldn't ignore the message. They needed an adult who wouldn't abandon them. If he himself wasn't capable of playing that role, at least he could ensure that someone more capable would help them. Faced with the officer's stern gaze, Henry opened his mouth to insist, but the words didn't come out immediately. He needed to gather courage, hope, and whatever else was left in his tired spirit. He wouldn't run away. He needed to face the officer, face the distrust, face the weight of being nobody, but still choose to do the right thing. He clenched his fist tightly for a moment, breathed, and straightened his spine, even in the face of the cold that squeezed his chest. There was no turning back. It was that or nothing. With a serenity he didn't know he possessed, Henry raised his chin and, despite the fear, told himself he wouldn't back down. He needed to try, needed to persist. The street remained hostile. The night advanced. Time was running against the two girls, and nothing besides that police officer could bring any light to the situation. At this moment, something inside Henry steadied itself. It didn't matter how many times they had humiliated him. It didn't matter how many aggressive looks or harsh words might come. The decision was made. He would go through with it, would talk to the officer, explain, insist, endure the pain of suspicion. He couldn't fail now. Almost without realizing it, he felt his jaw tighten, his expression become determined. He would do anything to make those girls' voices heard. Henry grits his teeth, determined to seek out a police officer at the nearby corner, hoping that authority will bring clarity and help the girls. The street seemed even colder when Henry approached the police officer at that corner lit by a solitary lamppost. The girls remained under his watch, still sitting at the bus stop back there, shivering from cold and fear. He forced a smile, trying to appear less frightening, but wasn't sure if the uniformed man would interpret his gestures well. He felt his heart beating fast, his voice wavering before even leaving his mouth. He needed to stay calm, explain the situation clearly. "Good evening, sir," Henry began, his tone soft, almost hesitant. "There are 2 children over there, alone, at a bus stop. I think they were abandoned." He tried to speak slowly, pointing with his finger. "They need help. I don't know what to do." The officer frowned, stepping forward. His stern expression made it clear he wasn't inclined to believe without questioning. "What's this story about?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Do you know them by any chance?" "No, sir. I found them there alone. They're cold, scared." Henry tried to maintain a steady gaze, but noticed the officer's skepticism. No surprise. A homeless man, poorly dressed, presenting 2 abandoned children. In the eyes of the law, it sounded suspicious. He understood the difficulty, but hoped for at least a hint of understanding. The officer took a quick look toward the bus stop, narrowing his eyes, but didn't move. "And you? Who are you?" he insisted, his voice dry. Henry swallowed hard, explaining carefully. "I'm just someone who wants to help, sir. I saw the girls there, with no one around. I thought the police could—" Before he could finish, the officer uncrossed his arms and stepped forward another step, forcing Henry to back away. "If they're not your daughters, and you don't know whose they are, why did you get involved? What are you trying to do?" he fired, without beating around the bush. Henry raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I just couldn't leave them there," he justified. "They need a safe place, someone to take care of them. I'm not in a position to—" "You can call someone, social services, something like that." The officer shook his head, impatient. "Look here, citizen. If you're not involved, get lost. We don't need trouble." The officer's hand touched his holster intimidatingly, a silent message that the conversation could end badly for Henry if he insisted. Henry felt his stomach turn. He couldn't accept the officer's logic. Sending him away wouldn't solve the girl's problem. He got nervous but tried to keep his voice calm. "The children are there, just look. You need to believe me. I have nowhere to take them. I can't leave them on the street." The officer rolled his eyes, took a few steps to the side, getting a better look at the bus stop. In the distance, the girls were huddled, almost invisible under Henry's coat. The uniformed man nodded, as if finally noticing them. Still, he didn't approach. "You just got here, told me this story. How do I know you're not trying to take advantage? What are you going to use the children for? To move people and beg for money? Don't try to be clever with me." Those words cut through Henry like a cold blade. He was trying to do good, and receiving accusations. "Sir, that's not it," he exclaimed, his voice hoarse, hands trembling. "I've already tried asking others for help and no one would listen. Please, you're a police officer, you can solve this." The officer let out a long sigh and approached Henry, almost touching his shoulder. "You solve it. Go to your corner. If you can't prove anything to me, I'm going to make you disappear from here." With a rough push, he made Henry step back a few paces. Henry's eyes widened, feeling the humiliation. "I'm not making anything up," he protested, but carefully, without raising his voice too much, fearing the situation would worsen. The officer merely clenched his jaw and raised his chin, looking down at Henry. At that moment, some people passed on the opposite sidewalk, noticing the strange scene. A homeless man arguing with a police officer near two abandoned children. Murmurs lowered into the night, sideways glances. Henry felt cornered. If he insisted, the officer could accuse him of contempt or worse. If he gave in, he would leave the girls to their fate. Desperation grew in his chest, a lump in his throat. He took another step back, raising his hands slowly. "Believe me, they're cold. They don't know where their mother is. I won't leave them there." The officer narrowed his eyes, his patience running out. "I don't know what you're planning, but I've seen many people using children to make money. Don't think you can fool me." Henry ran his hand through his disheveled hair, feeling his saliva dry up. He needed to show sincerity somehow. "Sir, if you want, search my pockets. I have nothing. I'm just a homeless man. I didn't ask for money, didn't ask for anything. Just help." There was an uncomfortable moment of silence. The officer seemed to be fighting internally, but his expression didn't soften. "Stay away from the children. I'll check the situation." Saying this, he turned around and walked toward the bus stop, where Emily and Claire watched him, frightened. Henry felt a glimmer of hope, but also fear that his presence, a stranger, would complicate things even more. He let the officer go ahead, keeping his distance, hands still raised. However, before reaching the girls, the officer glanced over his shoulder, noticing Henry standing there. He made an impatient gesture with his hand, signaling that Henry should step away. The homeless man stepped back a few paces, leaning against a dirty wall, resigned. He couldn't do anything else but watch. The scene was distressing, the officer bending over the children, asking something Henry couldn't hear. The girls huddled, nervous, not knowing if that man was trustworthy. The wind lifted old papers from the ground. The distant neon cast strange colors on the asphalt. In the background, a car accelerated, ignoring everything. Suddenly, in a split second, Henry felt a pull on his back. Turning around, he saw a hooded figure quickly slip away, disappearing into the darkness. He instinctively reached out, but it was too late. His small bag, containing the few belongings he had left, crumpled documents, old photos, some change, was gone. The thief left without a sound of protest. Disoriented, Henry faltered, looking around, finding no one to help. How could he ask for help? The officer already distrusted him. The children were there without support, and now he had lost what little he had. He felt a tightness in his chest, the relentless reality crushing any hope. His life was already difficult, but now he was completely stripped of resources. He took a deep breath, looking back at the bus stop. The officer seemed dissatisfied with the girl's answers or with the situation itself. Maybe he thought Henry was guilty of something. Nothing seemed to improve. The night dripped slowly, like thick oil, sticking to the skin of those who dared to challenge the invisible rules of the indifferent city. He examined the sidewalk, looking for any trace of the thief, but there was nothing but a bitter sense of injustice. The coat he had given to the girls remained over their fragile shoulders, the only proof of his good intention. His throat hurt, his head throbbed, and the cold seemed crueler than before. Was this the price of trying to do good? As he steps away, Henry feels someone pulling his bag and, upon turning around, realizes his few belongings were stolen. He looks into the void, devastated, having nothing left but the coat and the two frightened girls. Henry leaned against the cold wall, trying to process the blow. The night continued indifferently, streetlights casting whitish spots on the wet asphalt, and a smell of exhaust fumes hung in the air. Without his small bag, without any of his few belongings, he felt more helpless than before. He had come this far trying to help two abandoned girls, but nothing seemed to be going in the right direction. Once again, reality weighed heavily on his shoulders. He looked at the bus stop. The two children were still hugging, his coat over them, protecting them from the cold wind. From where he stood, he could hear soft crying, a contained sniffling. Both kept their distance from Henry, despite everything. It wasn't their fault. It was hard to trust a stranger, especially a dirty, poorly dressed man with a hesitant voice. He understood the fear, the natural distrust, but he felt his heart tighten. He wanted to be useful, but maybe he was just making the situation worse. He took a few steps toward the girls, slowly. He wanted to reassure them, tell them he wouldn't do any harm, but his own appearance didn't help. His tired face, the threadbare coat, the lack of a home. It was all very confusing and intimidating for them. Noticing his approach, the girls shrank further, pressing their bodies against each other, as if they could protect themselves alone. He crouched at a respectful distance, resting a hand on his knee. He tried to sound gentle. "Hey, I know you're scared. I won't hurt you. I just wanted to help." The words came out low, almost a whisper, fearing to frighten them even more. There was no response, just frightened looks. He then realized that even though he meant well, his mere presence caused more tension. That was devastating. He thought about leaving. Maybe if he walked away, some good Samaritan would appear and help without the distrust that fell upon him. But he remembered the suspicious pedestrian, the aggressive policeman. There was no guarantee that the girls would be safer if he left. At the same time, the feeling of powerlessness was eating away at him. He had lost his belongings, was being treated like a problem, and the children didn't trust him. Where would this end? He took a quick look around. The policeman had disappeared into the darkness, perhaps going to check the situation elsewhere, or simply tired of dealing with a scene that didn't fit into any simple rule. Passers-by still circulated at a distance, avoided eye contact, preferring to ignore that unlikely trio, a homeless man and two children abandoned in the cold of dawn. The city continued its insensitive course. Henry forced a small smile, even without receiving anything in return. He slowly stretched out his arm, touching the tip of the coat, trying to adjust it over the girl's shoulders to prevent the wind from getting in. The younger one immediately shrank back, giving a small panic sob. He withdrew his hand, feeling a pang in his chest. He needed to understand that, to them, he might seem as frightening as any other threat of the night. It was hard to convince them otherwise. Without their trust, everything became more complicated. Henry felt his head throb. He was tired, hungry, cold, and now stuck in this endless situation. For a moment it crossed his mind to abandon everything. Leave the girls there and go away, look for another place to sleep. That inner voice, bitter and cowardly, whispered, "You've done what you could, they don't believe in you, it's not worth it." But no, he couldn't do that. Despite all the pain, there was something inside him that prevented him from behaving like the rest of the world, that world that had already ignored the girls. That invisible promise he had made to himself, not to repeat the abandonment he had once experienced in his own flesh. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the cold air poke his lungs. No, he wouldn't leave. He would stay there even if motionless, until he found a solution. He looked fixedly at the girls. He would try another strategy, speaking softly, without moving, as if telling a secret. "I know you don't know me, but I'm not leaving here until I'm sure you're okay." His voice trembled slightly, realizing that for them, Pretty words were no guarantee at all. Still, he had to try. The girls didn't respond, just stared at him with large, frightened eyes. He expected no less. He imagined what was going through their minds. The fear, the uncertainty, the pain of having been left there by someone they should trust. Maybe they were waiting for their mother to return at any moment, or perhaps a miracle that would bring a kind and clean adult, someone without the appearance of defeat. But all they had was Henry, a stranger with nothing to offer but an old coat and good intentions that seemed insufficient. Time passed, and the cold seemed to get more intense. An uncomfortable silence dominated the street, interrupted only by distant engine noises and the rustling of plastic bags. Henry stood up slowly, without sudden movements, and walked to the edge of the sidewalk, looking at the end of the street. Maybe he would find some sign of help or a place where he could call someone without being met with hostility. He needed to at least try. If he stayed there motionless, the hours would advance without solution. That's when he spotted a female figure walking in the distance. She looked like a tall woman, wearing a long coat and carrying a briefcase. She had the bearing of someone who knew where to go, who wasn't just wandering. Could she possibly be a social worker, or something similar? Hope lit up in his chest, still timid, wavering. If that woman was a professional in charge of handling delicate situations, she could finally bring order to the chaos. On the other hand, Henry feared what she would think seeing him there, standing near the children. Would she also distrust him, think he was taking advantage? He closed his eyes for a second, trying to gather courage. Anything was better than remaining at the mercy of confusion and hostility. He needed to take the risk, try to talk to her. Maybe there was someone in the world willing to listen to him, to understand the situation before judging him. Swallowing his own insecurities, Henry prepared to call out to her as she approached. He needed to choose his words carefully. Couldn't scare her. His heart was beating faster. The figure continued advancing with firm steps, possibly attracted by the rumor that something strange was happening on that street. Would this be the first glimmer of understanding that night? Or just another look of disapproval and indifference? Deep down, all he wanted was to get those girls out of the cold, ensure they had someone to take care of them. Maybe if he could get this woman to understand the truth, he could finally rest a bit. He thought of his own daughter, how much he would want someone to help her if she were in danger. That thought hurt, but it also kept him strong. He was just a tired man, but he could still try to do the right thing. The woman in the long coat appeared at the end of the street, with firm and determined steps, as if she knew exactly why she was there. She carried a dark leather folder against her body, protected from the cold dawn wind. As she approached the bus stop, she noticed the two huddled and hesitant girls, the homeless man standing at a respectful distance, and the tense atmosphere that enveloped everything. There was no one else around. The police officer from before wasn't visible at that moment, but he couldn't be far. The woman raised her eyes to Henry, quickly assessing him, then turned to the children. "My name is Marta," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I'm a social worker. We received a call that there were 2 unattended children at this stop, without any guardian." Her eyes lingered on the girls, who were now watching attentively, unsure if they could trust her. "Are you okay?" she asked, kneeling and trying to appear welcoming. The children didn't respond immediately. Emily, the oldest, just shook her head negatively, pulling her coat tighter around her younger sister. Marta frowned, examining the situation. Clothes inappropriate for the cold, frightened looks the absence of a trusted adult. This was serious. She raised her face, facing Henry, who took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. I found them here alone," said Henry, his voice faltering. "I tried to call for help, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, remembering the suspicious pedestrian, the aggressive police officer, the hostility he had faced. Marta continued analyzing him, her eyes narrowed. It was clear she wanted to understand his role in this story. Who was this man, and why was he next to those children? "Do you know them?" asked Marta, her tone neutral, but loaded with expectation. Henry shook his head. "No, never seen them before. They were here when I passed by. They were cold, scared. I just wanted to help." He felt the need to repeat this, as if the words could finally convince her. Marta nodded slowly, but didn't seem convinced. "And where is their mother?" she insisted, turning to the girls. "Do you know where your mother is?" Claire, the youngest, bit her lip, trying to speak, but only a trembling sound came out. Emily, with a weak voice, risked, She left. Told us to wait. Didn't come back." Marta raised her eyebrows, surprised and indignant. A mother abandoning children in the middle of the night was a terrible situation, and this changed the tone of the conversation. She placed one hand on Emily's shoulder, trying to comfort her, without touching the younger sister to avoid frightening her. At that moment, a movement caught everyone's attention. The police officer Henry had approached before reappeared at the end of the sidewalk, walking toward the small group. His posture was still rigid, his gaze suspicious. As soon as he saw Marta, he approached, adjusting his belt. "The social worker arrived quickly," he commented dryly. Marta didn't respond, just stood up, maintaining her firm posture. "These two children were abandoned by their mother," she said, looking at the police officer. "Something's very wrong here." The officer cast a sideways glance at Henry, who lowered his head. "And this guy, who is he?" asked the officer, with a gesture of contempt toward the homeless man. Marta pressed her lips together, turning her attention back to Henry. "He says he found them here. Claims he doesn't know the girls." The officer crossed his arms, frowning. "Really? Because I saw him before, insisting, wanting my attention. I don't know what he's planning, but I doubt it's out of altruism." Henry raised his face, hurt by these words, but tried to stay calm. "Look, I have nothing to hide. If you want, you can search whatever you want. I have nothing. I just wanted someone to help these children." He spoke sincerely, but realized that every time he tried to defend himself, he seemed more suspicious. It was an invisible trap. The more he spoke, the more uncertain he sounded. Marta tilted her head, trying to read Henry's face. There was something in his expression, in his voice, that didn't match with a malicious plan. Still, she couldn't rule out the possibility that he was involved. The girl's own looks were confused, not indicating full trust in that man. It was a stalemate. "I need clarity," said Marta finally. "If this mother abandoned the children, we have a serious case. But I also need to understand who you are, why you're so involved." Henry shrugged, hands visible. "I was here, that's all. It was too early to ignore two children alone." The officer snorted, impatient. "Or maybe he's planning something, who knows? Either way, we can't just believe his words." Marta agreed with a slight nod. "We have protocols. We need to know what happened, why these children were left here. You have no way to prove you're not part of this?" Henry bit his lip. How to prove innocence when there's no evidence in your favor? He had no witnesses, had tried to ask strangers for help and been insulted. All that remained was his word and the fact that the girls were there before he arrived. But who would believe him? He felt cornered, watching Marta and the officer exchange tense looks. The children were clutching Henry's coat, even without fully trusting him. They needed warmth and protection, and the old coat was all they had at that moment. The situation was absurd. The victims there, vulnerable, and the only one trying to do something, was viewed with suspicion. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, imagining what his daughter would think if she saw him now, defenseless, trying to help and being treated like a criminal. Marta spoke again, her voice now a bit harder. "If you can't prove anything, the situation gets complicated. The girls can't say much, they're confused. I have no choice but to report everything, including your presence here." The officer crossed his arms, as if approving the decision. Henry felt a shiver down his neck. "I didn't do anything wrong. I don't want to be arrested for trying to help," he protested, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. Marta stepped forward, maintaining apparent calm. "I understand your frustration, but I need to ensure the children's safety and discover the truth. If you don't clarify your involvement, you risk being taken to the police station, at least until everything is cleared up." The girls, frightened by the idea of Henry disappearing, pulled on the coat, calling for him in low voices. "Don't go away," pleaded the youngest between sobs. This unexpected appeal left Henry in an even more difficult position. He didn't want to be seen as a villain, but he also couldn't disappear now without abandoning the children to their fate. Marta narrowed her eyes, analyzing the scene and feeling the tension increase. The pressure on Henry was clear. The officer frowned, waiting for the homeless man's next reaction. Henry, breathing heavily, felt his stomach churn. He was caught at a crossroads. If he stayed, he would be suspect. If he fled, he would seem guilty. The night offered no easy escape. Marta turns to Henry with a severe look. "If it doesn't become clear what you're doing here, I'll need to take you too." Henry feels his stomach churn at this possibility. Henry was short of breath, his chest tight from the injustice of the moment. Marta and the police officer stared at him without any indulgence. The children cried softly, and the relentless street offered no escape. His body tensed at the threat of being taken away, treated like a criminal when all he wanted was to help. He cast a brief glance at the girls, who remained clutching his coat, desperate not to be left alone. The possibility of running crossed his mind. If he disappeared into the shadows, who would know he had been there? But that would make him suspicious, a coward who confirms the worst impressions, and it would leave those two little ones alone at the most critical moment. He couldn't live with that. Running would be the same as signing them over to complete abandonment. His heart ached just thinking about it. Not knowing what to do, he took a step back, hesitant. At that moment, the girls grabbed his coat, preventing any attempt to escape. Emily whispered, desperate, "Don't go." Claire, younger, sobbed, her face hidden. This plea paralyzed him. He couldn't even pretend he would leave. Now, even involuntarily, he was stuck there, not just by the unjust accusation, but by the fragile bond that had formed between them. The children depended on him, even without being sure of who he was. His mere presence was, at that moment, the only anchor they had. Marta stepped forward, her posture firm like someone ready to fulfill what she had promised. The officer beside her maintained a cold, almost indifferent expression. Henry raised his hands, his voice coming out urgent. "Please believe me. I just stumbled into this situation. I have nothing to do with abandoning these children. I'm not a kidnapper, an exploiter, none of that. I just couldn't leave them alone in the cold." Marta didn't lower her guard. Skepticism was visible in her gaze. "Without proof, it's your word against what appears to be a very strange situation." The officer agreed with a slow nod, a cynical half-smile at the corner of his mouth. Henry felt his legs trembling. He needed to find a way to show the truth. The night was against him, as well as his appearance, the lack of documents or witnesses. But there was something that could help him, a subtle possibility. He swallowed hard and raised his voice enough to be clearly heard. "You can check the security cameras. The bus stop, the nearby streets, must have cameras. They will show that I arrived after the girls were already alone. That will prove that I didn't leave them here." For a moment, silence fell. Marta and the officer exchanged glances. Perhaps they hadn't expected Henry to offer a solution that could exonerate him if he were guilty. This put a seed of doubt in their suspicion. If he were involved, would he suggest a method that could incriminate him? It was too high a risk for a guilty person to take. Marta frowned, thoughtful. He noticed the opening. He hurried to insist. "Check the street cameras, please. There are stores nearby. One of them must have footage from outside. Then you'll see I did nothing wrong. I just saw the girls and stopped to help them." His voice was shaky but sincere. He needed them to believe him, or at least give the facts a chance. The officer, initially impatient, seemed to reluctantly consider the idea. He didn't like admitting he could be wrong, but Marta, who valued evidence, seemed more inclined to this course of action. She took a deep breath, running her hand over her coat, evaluating the possibilities. She made a sign to the officer and turned to Henry. "You're suggesting we check the security footage? This might take time, and if you're lying, it won't help at all." Henry nodded vigorously. "Do it. Look at the recordings. If the girls were left here by someone else, you'll see that I only appeared afterward." He tried to control his nervousness. He knew there was no plot against him, that the cameras would show the truth. Still, he feared something would go wrong, that the images would be inaccessible or wouldn't capture the right angle. Even so, it was his only hope. The girls looked at him with teary eyes, not understanding all the details, but perceiving the change in the adult's tone of voice. Marta took a few steps to the side, trying to see beyond the corners. Looking for a store or establishment that might have cameras. The officer remained impassive, however. This time he wasn't attacking Henry with accusations. Perhaps he was imagining what it would be like if the images confirmed the innocence of the man he had so readily judged. Henry felt his own heart beat harder. He was still far from proving anything, but at least there was a path to follow. He wouldn't be taken away by force, not at that moment, if they agreed to check the cameras. Everything would depend on the truth recorded in pixels and bytes. Marta turned to Henry again, her expression more stern than before. "We'll do this. We'll check the recordings now. If you're lying, there will be no more explaining afterward." There was a threat in the air, but also a glimmer of hope. She was giving Henry the chance to save himself through evidence. Henry swallowed hard, not having much more to say. He knew that if truth was on his side, this would be his salvation. He looked at the girls and tried to smile, a weak and tired smile, but sincere. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of relief for having found a way out, even if uncertain. The officer gestured for Henry and the children to follow him at a short distance. Marta walked ahead, looking for any establishment still lit. Henry followed the group, head down, but maintaining a firm step. He felt the weight of each second, each heartbeat. It was time for the truth, time to end the doubts that lingered in the air. As they walked along the sidewalk, the tension didn't decrease. The cold remained cutting, the sound of distant cars, the sour smell of the deserted street. Henry tried to think positively, but the fear of a technical failure or a wrong interpretation of the video still haunted his mind. He needed to trust in his own integrity, in the fact that he had done nothing but try to protect two defenseless children. Marta looked over her shoulder, making sure Henry wasn't trying anything. He raised his hands slightly, indicating he wouldn't run. There was no reason to run, not after proposing to check the cameras. All he wanted was to prove he wasn't a monster, an exploiter, that his presence there might have been an error in society's eyes, but not a crime. When they reached the front of a 24-hour store, Marta stopped, signaling to the officer that this was where they would try to get the footage. The children pressed closer to the coat, shivering with cold. Henry was nervous, but he had to trust that the proof of his innocence was about to be revealed. His forehead was sweating, despite the cold wind, and his stomach felt like a knot. Marta announces, "We'll check the recordings now." Henry feels a chill, fearing something might go wrong even though he knows he's telling the truth. The 24-hour convenience store had a flashing sign and a well-lit interior, contrasting with the icy darkness of the street. Marta entered first, followed by the police officer, while Henry and the girls waited outside under the watchful eye of a burly security guard. Emily and Claire gripped his coat tighter, fearing Henry might disappear if they all went inside. He, in turn, tried to convey calmness, although his heart was racing. The fear that the images might not clarify the whole truth tormented him. Still, he trusted what he had seen with his own eyes. The girls were already there when he approached. From inside, through the glass fogged by breath, Henry could see Marta talking to the store owner, a middle-aged man with well-groomed gray hair, who was looking at a computer screen at the counter. The police officer remained in the background, arms crossed, not wanting to interfere unnecessarily. Marta pointed to something on the screen, running her finger over the time marked in the monitoring system, rewinding the footage, while the store owner carefully moved the mouse. The girls were shaking, not just from cold, but from uncertainty. Henry approached as close as the security guard allowed and crouched down, maintaining a low and reassuring tone. "Everything will be fine. They're checking the footage. Soon we'll know what happened, and you'll be safe." Emily sniffled, rubbing her face with her little hand. Claire, more frightened, sobbed with her head resting on her sister's shoulder. Even without complete trust, Henry's presence was still better than total abandonment. The security guard, with a serious expression, watched Henry carefully, ready to prevent any sudden movements. He had no reason to trust this homeless man, but Marta's order was clear: maintain control of the situation and wait for confirmation from the footage. Henry showed no signs of disobedience, remaining still, focused on the girls. He really wanted everything to be resolved. Inside, Marta narrowed her eyes, pointing to a specific spot in the video. The store owner put a section of the footage in full screen. The police officer uncrossed his arms, leaning in to see better. The scene showed the sidewalk, the illuminated bus stop, and after a few seconds, the figure of a hurried woman appearing from the left side. She stopped at the bus stop, looking around, and the children, Emily and Claire, were already there, apparently brought by her. Then the woman left them on the bench, quickly arranged something around the girls, and hurried away, disappearing from the corner of the screen. There was no one else accompanying the children, no presence of Henry at this moment. Marta bit her lip, shaking her head with an expression of indignation. The proof was there. The mother or guardian of the girls had abandoned them without mercy, leaving without looking back. The camera's clock showed this occurred minutes before Henry appeared. Shortly after, the grainy image showed Henry's figure approaching, hesitant, taking off his coat and covering the girls. There was no attempt to flee, no violence, or any suspicious action. He was just trying to help them. The police officer stood motionless for a moment, processing what he saw. Marta raised her eyes and exchanged a brief glance with him, confirming that the suspicions against Henry were unfounded. With each frame analyzed, it became more evident that he wasn't guilty. On the contrary, he was the only one who tried to do something for the girls on that cruel night. Marta raised her index finger, asking the store owner to pause. Her face revealed complex feelings: relief at seeing the truth, indignation at the mother who had abandoned her daughters, and embarrassment for having suspected Henry. The officer cleared his throat, crossing his arms again, but now with a less aggressive posture. There was no possible refutation. The images told the exact story Henry had related. Outside, the girls began to grow impatient. Emily asked in a low voice, "Will they let you help us?" Henry sighed, looking through the glass. "I hope so, dear." He didn't know exactly what would happen, but that long wait seemed about to end. Marta left the store first, still holding the folder close to her body. The police officer followed closely. The security guard made way. Seeing the expression on Marta's face, a bit softer, less severe, Henry stood up slowly, without sudden movements. The girls huddled together, awaiting the outcome. The social worker took a deep breath before speaking. "We've checked the footage," she said in a firm voice, though no longer accusatory. "They show that you're telling the truth, Henry. The girls were already there when you arrived. The person who abandoned them, possibly their mother, left before leaving them alone. She paused, seeming to reflect. There's no reason to accuse you of anything. Henry felt his shoulders relax. A tear insisted on forming in the corner of his eye, but he blinked quickly to contain it. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from his chest. He wasn't a hero, but at least he wouldn't be taken away as a criminal. The girls, hearing this, moved closer to Henry, gripping his coat tighter. Even without understanding the whole situation, they sensed that something good had happened. The police officer, still somewhat uncomfortable, limited himself to a nod. He didn't apologize, but the fact that he no longer continued to accuse him was already a relief. He merely stepped away a few paces, going to talk with the store owner about the possibility of identifying the woman who had abandoned the children. Marta stepped forward, analyzing Henry more closely. What she saw now was an exhausted man, in worn clothes, with tired eyes, but no malice in his posture. These children will need immediate shelter, she stated. We'll take them to a temporary children's shelter. There, specialists will try to find relatives or a provisional home. Henry nodded, understanding that his task ended there. He couldn't be their father, but he could feel better knowing they wouldn't be left out in the cold. The social worker continued. And what about you, Henry? You also need a place to spend the night, don't you? I know a shelter that can take you in while you get reorganized. He was surprised. He hadn't expected anything for himself, just not to be accused. He thanked her with a shy smile. That would be very good. Marta gave a slight smile, discreet but genuine. Nighttime encounters didn't always result in something positive, but in this situation, a minimal gesture of solidarity could mean a lot. The child services van arrived silently, parking a few meters away. Marta called the girls, explaining that they would be taken to a safe place with hot food, clean beds, and people to care for them. Emily and Claire were nervous, but Henry, kneeling before them, said carefully, "You'll be fine now. These people will take care of you. I need to go, but I hope you understand. I never wanted anything but to help you." Emily looked at Henry with sad eyes, unable to express everything she felt. Claire, smaller, just murmured an almost inaudible, "Thank you." They entered the van, holding the hand of one of the caregivers. Henry remained outside, watching them leave. The van drove away, taking with it the two lives that, even for a brief moment, he had tried to protect. Marta stayed beside him, while the police officer walked away to check details with Central Command. She lightly touched Henry's arm, calling him by name. When he turned, her expression was one of recognition, not distrust. "It seems you were telling the truth." Henry closed his eyes, exhausted, but aware that the next step could change his destiny. The van with the girls had already disappeared around the street corner, taking with it all the weight of that distressing night. Henry stood still for a few moments, as if he could still feel the presence of the two children holding his coat. Now everything seemed calmer. Without the tension of suspicion, the cold air was just cold, no longer a dagger of mistrust. Marta, the social worker, remained beside him, looking at the void where the van had vanished, her expression serious but less harsh than before. "You did what you could," she said, her voice low and clear. It wasn't open praise, but there was recognition in her tone. Henry nodded, not knowing what to respond. He was exhausted. His body ached, his stomach growled. His mind was tired of fighting against the prejudice that had fallen upon him, even when he was just trying to help. Still, there was now an unknown relief. He wouldn't be taken unjustly, wouldn't be accused of a crime he hadn't committed. The police officer approached again, without looking directly at Henry. He had a more neutral and professional posture. "Their situation will be analyzed. We'll see if we can find any relatives. Will you be all right?" he asked, almost as if obligated to show some minimal concern. Henry understood it wasn't an offering of friendship, but at least it wasn't a threat anymore. "I'll try," he answered, without looking into the officer's eyes, focusing on Marta, who seemed to have more sensitivity. Marta cleared her throat, adjusting the folder under her arm. "I mentioned a temporary shelter. Are you still interested?" Henry raised his eyes, surprised that she insisted on the subject. It wasn't usual to receive any kind of support. He felt a lump in his throat, realizing the opportunity to, at least for one night, not sleep in the open. "Yes, please, that would be very good," he said, choosing his words carefully, fearing to seem demanding. She nodded her head, checking something on her phone. "I got a spot in a community shelter. It's nothing luxurious, but you'll have a bed, blankets, a meal. A volunteer will come pick you up in a few minutes." Henry thanked her, his voice broken by contained emotion. A bed, blankets, and a meal. After so many humiliations, this sounded almost like an undeserved gift. The officer, with nothing more to say, stepped away to talk on the radio. Marta and Henry stayed there under the awning, while a fine rain began to fall. Small drops sparkled against the streetlight. Henry huddled in his own coat, the same one that had sheltered the girls, and thought about how the course of the night had changed so many times. He wanted to believe that the two would have a better future away from there. He was sure that the memory of their frightened eyes would stay with him for a long time. Marta looked at the street, waiting for the car that would come to pick him up. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. She seemed to reflect on her own initial mistrust about the system that judged so quickly. He just embraced the certainty that, although his contribution seemed tiny, it hadn't been in vain. He had made some difference, even if small. It didn't take long for a vehicle with the emblem of a social service to park a few meters from where they were. The driver, a young man with a contained smile, waved to Marta, who responded with a slight smile. "This is the car," she said to Henry. "They'll take you to the shelter. There you can talk to someone, maybe tomorrow think about other options." Henry agreed, taking a deep breath. He walked to the car slowly, with steps a little firmer than before. He was tired, but less defeated. Before getting in, he turned to Marta, thinking of saying something in thanks, but the words caught in his throat. She seemed to understand. "Go rest," she just said lightly. It was a difficult night for everyone. With a shy wave, Henry got into the car. The driver asked his name, introduced himself, and quickly explained what he would find at the shelter. A simple room, shared with others, a hot meal, a place to shower, and minimal space to reorganize his thoughts. Henry thanked him in a low voice, looking at the wet streets passing by the window. The city remained indifferent, but at that moment, there was a corner for him, at least for that night. The journey was relatively short. In 15 minutes, the vehicle stopped in front of a modest building with a discreet sign at the entrance. 2 yellow lamps illuminated the metal door. There was no luxury at all, but upon entering, Henry smelled food in the air and felt the presence of other men and women walking through the corridors with soft steps. A volunteer in a light coat received him, indicating where his temporary room was. Going up some steps, Henry found a single bed with clean sheets, a faded but fresh-smelling blanket, and a small side table. There were 2 other men in the room, one older, sitting in the corner, leafing through a newspaper. Nobody asked questions. A nod was enough to establish a truce of silence. Henry placed his folded coat on the bed, felt the mattress sink under his weight. It was soft, much more than the cardboard he usually relied on. He sighed, relieved. After leaving the few things he had, actually almost nothing since he had been robbed, Henry went down to the cafeteria, a small space with wooden tables. The meal offered was simple: warm soup, bread, and coffee. He ate slowly, feeling an internal warmth he hadn't felt in days. Nobody demanded explanations or judgments. The sound of cutlery and low conversations formed a discreet music, very different from the aggressive cacophony of the street. There, at least, he wasn't treated like a criminal. When finished, he went up again, passed through the corridor where some people were watching the old television in the community room. The news talked about distant matters, nothing that directly concerned his tumultuous night. The storm hadn't intensified, but the cold wind outside was now just a distant detail, as Henry was protected. Back in the room, he sat on the bed, took off his worn shoes and rubbed his sore feet. He remembered the girls, Emily and Claire, and hoped they were as warm as he was now, or even more so. Their image wouldn't easily leave his memory, especially the innocent question the younger one had asked. "Can you be our dad?" He couldn't be their father, but at least he had tried something. It wasn't much, but it was better than turning his face the other way. That night, Henry hadn't become a hero. He hadn't changed the world, hadn't achieved any great feat, but he had made a simple choice, not to ignore the pain of 2 children. And somehow, that had given him a step forward, small, true, toward a less uncertain place. Now, with the chance to rest without the danger of the street, maybe he could think about future steps, even without grandiose plans. He accepted reality for what it was, without illusions, but with a touch of recovered humanity. He turned off the light beside the bed, feeling strangely lighter. The distant voices, steps in the corridor, nothing bothered him. He knew he wasn't solving all his problems, but a gesture of compassion, even if small, already illuminated a bit of the internal darkness he carried. It was a beginning, a thread of hope. Henry lies down and stares at the shelter's ceiling, imagining the girls in safety, and wondering how the next day will be in this new reality. The morning brought a soft light that passed through the shelter's barred windows. Henry opened his eyes, feeling slightly strange. The bed was soft, the room quiet, and for a moment he needed to remember where he was. He looked around and saw other men sleeping or already getting up silently. No one looked at him with disapproval. There were no hard sidewalks, cutting wind, or accusing glances. It was just the beginning of an ordinary day, in a space where he didn't need to hide from the police or worry about the indifference of passers-by. He got up carefully, putting his feet on the cold but clean floor. He put on his coat, which now no longer had the urgent function of protecting him from cruel street wind, but was still a reminder of the previous night. He ran his hand through his disheveled hair, tried to fix his beard a bit. It wasn't a mirror he had there, but the window glass crack returned a less worn-out image than usual, perhaps because he had slept for a few hours without startling. The shelter's communal kitchen wasn't large, but it smelled of freshly warmed bread and warm coffee. Henry entered timidly, not wanting to draw attention. A middle-aged staff member with a gentle smile was serving coffee cups at a small table. Other residents waited their turn, unhurried, exchanging few words. He went to the end of the small line, observing the contained gestures of others, trying to understand the routine of that place. When his turn came, the woman handed him a mug, without saying much. Henry thanked her softly, feeling the warmth rise through his nose, the simple aroma of coffee bringing certain peace. He took small sips, leaning against a wall, keeping some distance from conversations. Not because he distrusted others, but because he wasn't used to communal spaces. Soon a volunteer appeared, announcing they needed help organizing the food storage room. Henry, with nothing else to do, raised his hand and offered help. It was better to keep busy than to keep brooding thoughts in his head. The storage was in the back, a narrow room with boxes of supplies, canned goods, packages of rice and flour. The volunteer indicated they needed to reorganize the shelves, throw away what was expired, clean the floor. Henry accepted the task without questioning. In silence, he began moving boxes, stacking them in a more orderly way. It was simple work, without glamour, but each organized box made him feel a small sense of usefulness. There, nobody cursed at him, nobody looked at him as a problem. He was just another pair of helping hands. While moving a heavier box, He remembered the girls. He imagined how their awakening would be that day. Maybe they were already in a children's shelter, warm, receiving attention. He sincerely hoped they would find some kind relative, or at least people who would help them overcome the trauma of the previous night. He didn't know if he would ever know their fate, but he tried to come to terms with ignorance of the future. He did what he could, and that had some value, even if minimal. He spent the morning on small tasks, helped sweep the corridor, cleaned a table that served as a reading space, collected old newspapers. He wasn't a hero, but these small actions gave him a modest sense of belonging. He heard conversations here and there, people telling stories, names he didn't recognize. He heard an elderly man, sitting on a bench, talk about the time he worked in construction and how he was now trying to get back on his feet. He heard a woman tell the staff member that she was there only temporarily, waiting for something better. Henry didn't intrude, just listened in silence, accepting the diversity of destinies that converged in that shelter. At lunch, the cafeteria was fuller. There was a noise of low conversations, cutlery, and plates. The food was simple: rice, beans, a cooked vegetable, and a piece of bread. Henry ate slowly, without greed, feeling grateful for each forkful. Outside, the rain had stopped, the sky still cloudy, but the air less aggressive. A staff member passed collecting plates, exchanged a discreet smile with Henry, showing she was satisfied to see him there, well-behaved and calm. After lunch, Henry explored the shelter a bit more. There was a small room where some used books were stacked. He picked one at random, leafing through yellowed pages. It had been a while since he had read anything. The letters danced in his tired brain, but he sat there, the book open on his lap, without really diving into the story. It wasn't the content that mattered at that moment, but the sensation of normality, leafing through a book in a safe environment, without the urgency of survival knocking at the door. Later, he took a brief walk down the corridor, smelled the soap used to clean the floor. He climbed the stairs to a window on the upper floor, from where he could see the street. People passed by hurriedly. Cars followed their constant coming and going. He could imagine how much the city was still the same out there, hostile, indifferent. But, for a brief interval of time, he was on the inside, protected by those simple walls. It wasn't the solution to all his problems. He knew that. It was just a moment to breathe, an interval in the constant pressure of not having a roof, a temporary escape from the heavy hand of the street. Throughout the afternoon, Henry participated in a brief conversation with one of the volunteers, a young man who spoke little but listened very well. Henry told, in a summarized way, without dramatic details, what had happened the night before, the issue of the abandoned girls, how he had been suspected without guilt. The young volunteer nodded his head, understanding the difficulty of the situation. "Unfortunately, this happens more than we imagine," commented the young man, without judgments, just recognizing the social problem that surrounded them. Henry felt that at least at that moment someone was listening to his voice without prejudice. At nightfall, the shelter's routine resumed. Some went to take showers, others talked in low voices, planning the next day, while Henry just absorbed the relative calm of the environment. There were no promises of great change in his life. Nobody there offered immediate employment or miracles. But the existence of this pause, this possibility of having a place, even if temporary, was already an advance compared to the previous night. He was no longer fighting against the suspicion of a non-existent crime, was no longer alone in the cold without help. It was a fragile stability, but real. He remembered his daughter, whom he hadn't seen in years, and wondered if one day he would have the courage to look for her, or even what he would find if he tried. He had no answers, but he no longer condemned himself for not having them. Given the intensity of the last night, he had learned to value each small victory: a bed, a shelter, a bowl of soup, a simple good morning without ulterior motives. Before going to sleep, Henry peeked at the shelter's door, the same one he had entered that morning. He knew he couldn't stay there forever. The shelter offered a bed for a few days, maybe a week, but then he would need to find another way to continue. Still, he felt less afraid now. He had learned that the world outside hadn't changed, but his perspective could change a bit. Maybe it was possible to face the streets, the people, with a less frightened look. It wouldn't be easy, but he didn't need to solve everything immediately, one step at a time. Looking at the shelter's door, he imagined himself going out tomorrow just to breathe some fresh air and test himself. He wouldn't go far. It didn't need to be a complete fresh start, but a small test of courage. See the city with different eyes, a little less terrified, perhaps realizing that there were still people capable of listening and understanding. Even if there were no guarantees, this idea strengthened him, gave him something to think about, beyond the pain and distrust of the past. Henry looks at the shelter's door, thinking about leaving there tomorrow, even if just for a few minutes, to glimpse the world with slightly less frightened eyes. The morning sun cast a pale light on the asphalt, still wet from the previous night. Henry had slept reasonably well in the shelter, without startles. He woke up before the others, sitting on the bed for a few minutes, absorbing the quietness. The shared room still held the soft snoring of other men, souls as tired as his. It was strange to feel this way, less cornered, but also less paralyzed. He got up slowly, put on his coat, ran his hand through his thin beard, and tried to minimally fix his graying hair. It was time to go out for a few moments, without running away, without disappearing, just testing himself against the world out there. He went down the stairs and greeted the employee who was organizing the table with coffee and bread, quietly thanking her for the care. Without prolonging the conversation, he left the shelter through the metal front door. The fresh street air brought a smell of an awakening city. Car noise, distant voices, the creaking of a garage door. Henry put his hands in his pockets, took a deep breath. It was the same city, the same potential indifference, but he felt he could face it differently. He wasn't a new man, but a man with a slightly different perspective. He walked along the sidewalk, avoiding the dark alleys he used to frequent. He passed by a bakery and smelled the sweet aroma of fresh dough and strong coffee. He had no money to buy anything, but this didn't discourage him as much as before. He continued walking, observing the facades, the simple shop windows, some stores opening their doors, employees sweeping the entrance. He wasn't invisible, but he also didn't attract hostile looks. Perhaps people were too worried about their own routines to notice him, which, at this moment, was a relief. At a corner, he spotted a bus stop, and his memory immediately took him back to that fateful night. How would the girls be now? He had no idea, and he had to accept that. He hoped they were safe and supported somewhere, that they had found someone capable of giving them a home, or at least protection. He wasn't their father. He couldn't save the world, but he believed he had added a thread of humanity to the sequence of events that marked that night. It was little, but it existed. He passed by a small, fenced park where some children played under the watchful eye of adults. The scene brought a subtle smile to his lips. Another reality, other destinies, and there he was, just a man walking without needing to hide. He found a bench on the sidewalk in a less busy stretch and sat down to rest a bit. He watched birds pecking at invisible crumbs, a mailman passing by on a bicycle, a couple quietly arguing while waiting for the traffic light to change. Life was pulsing. In this internal balance, Henry thought about his own trajectory. He had lost a home, lost contact with his daughter, lived on the margins for so long that he had forgotten the taste of belonging to something. But last night, he had faced distrust, injustice, and still persisted in doing the right thing. He hadn't demanded anything in return, hadn't portrayed himself as a victim. He had just refused to act with the same indifference that had hurt him so much. It was a subtle change, but fundamental. He raised his eyes to the sky, cloudy but not threatening storm. The world remained complex. The city hadn't become kinder because of one small gesture. However, he felt a new balance within himself. He knew that somewhere, the girls had been taken in, and although he didn't know the outcome of their story, he chose to believe that somehow they were in better hands. What happened the night before would be just one of the many stories the city swallows daily. But for Henry, it possessed an intimate and lasting meaning. He got up from the bench and continued walking, with no defined direction. His head less heavy, his spine a little straighter. It wasn't a miracle. The prejudice against people like him wouldn't disappear. There would still be humiliations, challenges, hunger, cold. But the feeling of having acted according to his conscience, against the current of indifference, gave him a firmer internal foundation. At an intersection, he stopped next to a lady carrying heavy bags. She looked at him sideways, perhaps suspicious, perhaps just curious. He didn't say anything, didn't offer help to avoid frightening her, but also didn't look away like a guilty person. He stayed there, waiting for the traffic light to change, patient, calm. When the green light appeared, they crossed the street at the same time. The lady went ahead and Henry too, each on their own path. Nothing special, just a moment shared without hostility. Ahead, a garbage truck roared, collecting Tide bags. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it was part of the landscape. Henry drew in the air, accepting the city as it is. He wouldn't wear a mask of unrealistic optimism, but he had decided that he wouldn't let himself be so easily beaten down. If he couldn't change the outside world, at least he could balance his own inner world. Getting close to the shelter again, he thought about what he would do with the rest of the day. Maybe help a bit more, perhaps talk to someone who understood his situation, or simply rest. It wasn't about finding a great solution today, but maintaining an honest, dignified rhythm. He had little, but he had himself and the value of his choices. This was more than he could say in other times, when he saw himself as just a disposable number in the crowd. He looked at the busy street, the flow of cars and pedestrians. He no longer felt the desire to shrink into a corner or disappear. He didn't need to shout his story, but he also wouldn't let the fear of others' opinions prevent him from doing what he thought was right. The memory of the previous night would be like a moral anchor, a reminder that humanity can be hard, but can also be touched by simple gestures. He started walking again, thinking about the corners that would come next. He didn't know exactly where he would go in the coming days, didn't have a concrete plan, but he no longer faced the future with the same dread. He might not be a hero, but he was a man who had faced a difficult situation and, despite everything, preserved his integrity. This gave him strength to move forward, one step at a time, without needing to look away from himself in the improvised mirror of any shop window. With the traffic noise in the background, Henry moves forward, his mind clearer, facing the next corners with the look of someone who will no longer deviate from their own acts of humanity.